I'm delighted to talk to you, and it makes me feel full of joy and happiness to have this opportunity. But in fact, we're at a time of great difficulties, challenges. We all know that. The global pandemic is only one of many challenges we face. In my book, on the first page of the first full chapter, I rattle off a list of the problems that are going to make a difference for our lives if we don't solve them. So I do mention global pandemics flying to us on airplanes. Some people said, oh, I was so prescient, but it wasn't hard to notice that it had been happening through the years. In fact, I would go to Asia frequently when SARS was popping up, and I learned to avoid shaking hands and washing my hands a lot. So we've known about this. We've known about the climate change crisis. We certainly know that inequality has been growing in some places or simply not changing, even though we have, for example, in the 20th century, made the biggest advances in health ever, almost doubling life expectancy over that century, except that within a few blocks of each other in major cities, there are districts where the difference in life expectancy is still 20 years or more because of inequality, including in education and health, in the ability to own property, accumulate wealth, and so forth. So these problems are actually the problems that millennials say on global surveys bother them the most. And these are problems that we have to do something about urgently. But I was attending too many dinner parties accompanied by fine wines. Hold this, so fine wine. I have to learn how to hold these with the virtual background. Fine wines, and that's not a typo. Wines, W-H-I-N-E-S, meaning the complaining cry and not the alcoholic beverage. People like to talk about these things, complain about them, decry them, but it's much harder to stimulate people to do anything about them. And in fact, whining is depressing, it's demoralizing, passivity is depressing, but activism is energizing. And so when we founded the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard, in all the work I've been doing, it has all been designed to activate and energize people to do something about problems, often one action, one step, one initiative at a time. Very big problems don't get solved in one bold global stroke. We know that doesn't happen. They get solved because of lots of innovators on the ground, inside companies, outside companies, within communities, who decide to do something about the problems. And so I tell the stories of many of those people, some famous, many not famous, many accomplished but not famous, and how they have made a difference in the world. So I'm going to give you, I just gave you a sample of my bumper stickers. I'm going to give you 5 bumper stickers that run through the major points that I hope you'll take away about what it means to make a difference in the world, how you can do it. So the first is, and it is the title of my book, think outside the building. Okay, you can see that the virtual background wants to get rid of everything I'm showing here, but think outside the building. What I mean by the building, the structures that confine us, the sectors, the silos, the systems that we live in, the unquestioned assumptions. No wonder we haven't solved some of the problems that I rattled off, because we often think about them in narrow and conventional ways. We often think about them in terms that dominant groups have established, and we think of them as being owned by certain professions and certain buildings. But we know, we're learning, that health is not the hospital. Health is a function of so many things beyond hospitals. By the time hospitals see people, if they see them at all, it's often after accumulated problems, many coming from inequalities. We know that the pandemic tends to be affecting Black and brown people more than others. That's now scientifically established by many studies. And so health isn't the hospital. We have to think about it much broadly. It's community access, it's economic circumstances, it's the quality of education. And education is not the classroom or the school building. In fact, if anything, the pandemic is showing us we'd better learn to do education in a much broader way. Education is now digital, it's at home, it's in small clusters. We have to reinvent our assumptions. Of course, classrooms are important. I miss my classrooms desperately. I'd rather be in a classroom with people than on a screen. But we have to learn to add all of these tools to make a difference. And so education is parents, it's economic circumstances, it's nutrition. All of these problems are intertwined. And when you come to a big problem like climate change, it's not only not a building, it's not owned by any one sector, any one entity. In fact, there's a range of people, all of whom claim responsibility for climate change, and often they're at war with one another. For example, government ministries versus NGOs or nonprofit organizations who think they're noble, they're the ones who have the right answer. And then that means leaving out business because business is the enemy. So what you have in these complex, multifaceted social system problems, you often have warring factions over who owns the problem. You have narrow thinking, and we have to get people out of their buildings. So one way we get out of the buildings is we dream, is we think about the world as it could be, not necessarily the world as it is, and we get out of the places in which we're comfortable. We travel, we see things, and if we can't travel physically, we might travel virtually. It's by talking to people who are different from you. That's why diversity is so important. It's not that we just substitute one body type for another body type. It's that we want people with a range of experiences to learn from. And so for these big problems, we have to dream bigger than we are. Dream bigger than you are. Whatever you're dreaming, make it bigger and bolder. After all, it takes as much time and energy to dream small as it does to dream big. And so let's just take climate change for a moment. A German banker who was ultimately based in London, working for major banks, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was very concerned about climate change. He's just one guy, but he had worked in project finance, and he had seen, for example, when they were financing an undersea cable under the Pacific, exactly how much plastic there was floating in the Pacific, how many problems there were in the Pacific. And he cared deeply about oceans. He had grown up on the North Sea. He decided to do something we always tell people they shouldn't do. You know that saying, you can't boil the ocean? Well, Torsten Thiele decided to boil the ocean, or actually stop it from boiling. Not to boil the ocean means don't take anything on so big that you couldn't possibly accomplish it. But that's not true. If you settle for less than the big goal, you might not accomplish anything. So he said, I'm going to do something about the oceans. And after all of his travels and discussions with people who are often very different in countries all over the world, going to numerous meetings, there are thousands of groups around the world and conventions and convenings of people interested in climate change. They may be virtual now, but they're still happening. And he realized a gap. When you dream big and you care about solving a problem, you have to be attentive to the gaps. What's missing? What is not contained in the building? And he realized that there was no financial perspective. Exactly for that reason I talked about earlier. The nonprofits didn't want to talk to business. Business was evil. They were the enemy. Governments were very jealous of their territory, even though no one owns the oceans. You only own a little bit offshore, and then the rest, there's no sovereignty for oceans. And he realized this big gap. And so he decided his dream was, we need a World Bank for oceans. A big idea. Well, in 5 or 6 years, he has managed to put finance in the equation. He has helped The Economist magazine with contests for the best business ideas that will help save the oceans. He knows the people who designed the plastic shoes that Adidas made out of that marine plastic washed up in the Pacific. He has encouraged and energized a new point of view. He has gotten bankers at the table with NGOs to talk about common interests, insurance companies to talk together in Bermuda, where a lot of them are based, about their losses because we don't have undersea sensors. We can't predict. We all depend on the oceans for food, for shipping, and yet we had not seen a major ingredient. So he dreamed bigger than he was, and he is making things happen because he is building cross-sector, multi-stakeholder coalitions, and that's my next bumper sticker. It doesn't take a village. That's the African proverb. Well, yeah, it takes a village, but a village is too small. It takes more than a village. It takes a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder coalition. Lots of villages, lots of sectors working together. And in the education space, for example, and given that you're going to be talking about social mobility, a couple of the stories that I talk about in my book of organizations that are already scaling, trying to do something about education for greater equality. One of them is an NGO started in the US, also very active in the UK. It's now in London, Birmingham, and Manchester, called City Year. And City Year is getting young people to spend a year, their City Year, tutoring, mentoring kids in at-risk children in at-risk schools, and helping them learn to stay in school and graduate, because the high school dropout crisis is one that prevents people from going on to be college ready and to go to college. And that was one big cross-sector multi-stakeholder coalition. In fact, they were just a little community program in Boston, and then they would show it off to people because Massachusetts is next to New Hampshire, where the first presidential primaries are held in the US. They invited, in 1992, they invited every presidential candidate to come visit. And every single one turned them down, except one, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was elected president and immediately worked with City Year and others to create a law about national service and a government function. So now we have a little program. It had corporate partners. It had young people who were in the core that did the tutoring and mentoring. And now we have national funding and government support. Cross-sector, multi-stakeholder, 30 years later, has grown to 29 sites in the US, 3 in the UK, 2 in South Africa. And we could do more internationally, but there's so much to do in the US. And it's now a force for changing education, because when you build that coalition, you don't just keep your own program going. That's inside the building thinking. We start a cause, we start a nonprofit, we start a corporate responsibility effort, and we want to grow and have impact through our effort. No. What City Year and others do is they want to have impact by growing the entire ecosystem, by encouraging many other groups to join them in a common cause. And so they are now having education improvement teams in every city in which they operate that consists of the education establishment. It consists of the nonprofits serving education, and City Year is a convener, not the central element. One other example that I think is terrific because it's a new partnership and it's now starting to spread around Europe. IBM started it, a major corporation. IBM has always been interested in education, and IBM is now responsible for, I call it reinventing high school. High school or secondary school was basically public high school or secondary school, I should say. And I know that the word public school means something different in the UK than it does in the US, but I'm talking about truly public, free, government sponsored 12 years of education for everybody. Was invented in Massachusetts, spread throughout the United States, but yet it hasn't been reinvented for well over 100 years. IBM was very concerned about jobs of the future and also all the people left behind in the digital economy. And so they created a cross-sector multi-stakeholder coalition to reinvent that. They have invented with school districts, government school systems, and other employers something called the 6-year high school. 6 years, 12 years, your 4 years of secondary school plus 2 years of, we call it community college or a junior college, 2 years of college, all in one degree, 6 years of high school. Now, when I first heard that idea, I thought it was insane. Personally, I hated high school. I couldn't wait to get out and go to college. I kept begging my parents to let me go to one of the colleges that you could start in 11th grade, not having graduated. But IBM did it, 6 years. And the students who are in the first cohorts, who are largely from at-risk backgrounds, they're people of color. Many of the first cohort in a 6-year program, just showing how much talent there is, graduated with both degrees in 4 years. And now one of the people we talk about a lot in the first cohort has a $50,000 a year. What is that in euros? Or in pounds now? A big job at IBM, and is studying for his 4-year college degree, and he's probably going to go ahead and get a doctorate with all those tech skills. That's a reinvention made possible because a company in partnership with, first of all, the K through 12, the secondary school, government school system, the 2-year college system, they all had to partner. They had never talked to each other, pretty separate. And then employers. IBM was soon joined by employers whose names you'd know. Cisco and Microsoft and Verizon and others. And in cities where they did not have a critical mass of very big employers, the employer's role was to send tutors, offer internships, and promise the graduates a job interview. Not a job, but an interview. But that was such an incentive that they have very high rates of attendance, and it's considered a huge success. President Obama mentioned it 3 times in his State of the Union address. It has been growing all over the world. Australia, now France is doing something like it with IBM's help. Cross-sector, multi-stakeholder, start with one, start with a pilot, gather others, get others to join you, because they will have an equal role and equal stake in it. That's really important. It's not owned by anybody. Yes, IBM provides a lot of the support and the playbook, but in cities where I started to say there's no one big employer who could take it on, for example, more rural areas, there are hospitals, for example. Hospitals need tech schools. So they would create a collaboration of the hospitals and of smaller employers to be the mentors and tutors, offer the job interview, and tailor the curriculum to getting skills that would help people in the future. And as I said earlier, our poster child graduate, Radcliffe Sattler, he's as interested in the liberal arts, but he has tech skills. And he has a job, a high-paying job, and he's going to get a doctorate someday out of a poor background in a poor part of the city. I'm very excited and proud of those efforts. Some of them start even smaller with individuals who decide they want to make a difference. For example, Mary Louise and Bruce Cohen. I love talking about the Cohens. They're both lawyers, very, very accomplished people in their own careers, but they decided they had to solve the Syrian refugee crisis. Now that's dreaming bigger than you are. That's kind of a big problem. They traveled, they talked to people at UNICEF and the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, and they began to see that there were many skilled people in the refugee camps. And you know, we think of refugees as ragtag people who are on boats across the Mediterranean, desperate to get into Europe, and they're a problem. Well, they saw these same refugees as often an opportunity, that there were many people with high skills, highly educated, who were eager to work. And there were many employers in parts of the world who couldn't fill certain jobs because they weren't attractive to millennials, like jobs in rural manufacturing areas or jobs in certain kinds of skilled trades. Well, now, a few years later, their organization called Talent Beyond Boundaries, something small that two people started, now places skilled refugees in Canada, Australia. They're working on Morocco. The US is a problem at the moment, even though they had a State Department grant to begin with. You know, we have to get over some problems in the United States before we're receptive. But other countries are receptive. They're now partnering with a very big global NGO in the UK to grow this entity. So first of all, this is dreaming bigger than you are and thinking outside the building, because refugees have been seen as a humanitarian crisis. We give them a little money, try to place them somewhere, otherwise they're a problem. They saw it as a solution to a labor market problem. Think about how that flip in thinking outside conventional channels, opened opportunities. So they've placed butchers who are skilled at cutting certain esoteric cuts of meat in Australia. They have placed people with high skills in certain kinds of manufacturing in rural Canada. And those people are delighted to be there, even though that manufacturer couldn't attract young people from the cities. He is now one of the biggest advocates. So their network of supporters and partners has grown. They thought of it a little bit in the beginning as an Uber for refugees. That is a matching platform. You had employers on the one side, you had people with skills on the other side. Let's get them together. That's outside the building, cross-sector, multi-stakeholder thinking. My next bumper sticker is one of my most famous, if I do say so myself, that it's Kanter's Law. I call it Kanter's Law. Everybody should have a law named after them, even if you have to name it yourself. Kanter's Law is that everything can seem like a failure in the middle. Everything in the middle. You know, we love beginnings. We love the announcement. And in corporate social responsibility, a lot of the attention goes to the announcement. Aren't they generous? Isn't that wonderful? Or maybe to the first accomplishments. It's just the middle that's hard work. It's the middle in which your alliance can fray. It's the middle in which things are disrupted because of unexpected obstacles. So one of the people stories I like to talk about in my book is Richard Fahey, and his thought partner, who started an entity to bring affordable alternative energy to West Africa. That means solar cells. And by the way, because everything is connected in a system, this is a big systems problem for education, for example. If there is no electricity, and 97% of the people in Liberia, for example, were off the electric grid. If there's no electricity and you don't have a generator, which most people don't, then kids can't read at night. So how do they keep up with their schoolwork? Parents often have to walk miles and miles to where there is a generator to charge a cell phone. So this problem of affordable energy and green energy, which is great for the climate, is also a problem for education. It's a problem for health, nutritious food. Well, Liberia, for example, is on the coast. There's a lot of fish. Fish is full of protein, very healthy, but that fish couldn't get to the interior because of no refrigeration. So suddenly the solar cells were a solution to a health and nutrition problem too. But in the middle, actually almost from the beginning, everything that could go wrong went wrong. And that's what you have to think about. Anything that you do that's new or different, an awful lot of things you didn't expect are going to go wrong. First of all, the first batch of solar cells arrived on the docks in Monrovia. Not a single one worked. They had been ordered from China via a Danish engineer. None of them worked. So you have to be innovative, flexible, creative, even from the beginning. So they found there were a lot of kids, young men, working under cars on a famous street in Monrovia, fixing cars. And they said, you know, certain car parts are a lot like these solar batteries. And they recruited the street kids to work on repairing the solar batteries. They did. And suddenly they had a new workforce that was also bringing jobs to poor people. Then they face other problems. There was a little embezzlement. It's a relationship-oriented culture. So somebody's relative was hired who did some embezzlement. They solved that problem. The biggest middle they faced was Ebola. So this wasn't the first pandemic to start disrupting everybody's lives, Ebola. And so Monrovia was going to shut down. And so what their company, Liberia Energy Network, did was they sent the workers home with 2 months of pay for the first month so that they could buy food for their family and be well stocked. They thought about their workers first. And because of that, and because of their creative response to the middle, they had a very loyal workforce, all of which wanted to come back and work for them. And they caught the attention of certain large multinationals that decided they would rather buy the energy from this values-oriented company than from the corrupt government system. And so suddenly they had a new market. They're suddenly having to supply big batteries for the big energy needs of big companies working in Liberia. And they have pivoted, they have grown their businesses to solve all kinds of problems and with new customers because they mastered the messy middles. They did it because they dreamed bigger than they are. That is, they had a mission and values and a sense of purpose that was so important that they couldn't let it go. And those values extended to how they treated their workforce. They couldn't stop because they had partners. And when you have a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder coalition, you have partners you've promised something to. You don't suddenly say, oh no, it's way too hard, we're gonna stop. You have to find a creative way to keep going. They did that, and they're growing very successfully today because of what I call my final bumper sticker. Okay, the optimism of activism. I talked earlier about fine wines. Whining does nothing for us except make us depressed. But getting active, doing, finding something, however small, to start. I mean, you don't have to necessarily solve the biggest problem of the world, but I hope you'll dream about it. You don't necessarily have to start something that grows to many cities, many countries, although wouldn't that be nice? Instead, you simply have to get moving. This is a wonderful time in this awful pandemic. Wonderful because we have the time to reflect. And the time to stand back and think, when we come out of this, what kind of a world do we want? What do we want health to be? What do we want education to be? How do we want to treat the climate? How do we want to deal with racial injustice, gender justice? How do we truly want to become not a set of warring tribes, but one planet that takes care of all of us? So thank you, and I look forward to our dialogue.